All right. The topic I want to cover today, which is very much continuous with what we talked about last week. And last week we spoke about what an important period this is for Joe Biden, for the Democrats, for the country, in terms of this coming week. We'll have to see how long it drags on, but the possibility that either there will be the signature legislative accomplishments of Biden's first term as president, or alternatively, that his legislative agenda will collapse under its own weight. And it is a hefty agenda. I think it's a very interesting strategy that Biden and the Democratic leadership of Congress have hit upon, which is to include basically everything that Biden wants to accomplish in his first term in office legislatively in a single large kitchen sink piece of legislation. And it's actually really two pieces of legislation, one of which is the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but the other, the piece of legislation that with some possibility will be hammered out this week. That Biden was on the phone apparently most of the day, Wednesday and Thursday, working on members of Congress, rest of members of Congress, to try to get them to align. That piece of legislation, I think, is maybe a once in a generation set of transformative objectives, changing the role of government, changing the funding for government, changing the kinds of care, the nature of our infrastructure, our economy, the decency of our society. But I'm going to emphasize one aspect of it in particular, and that is its implications for racial equality in the United States. And I want to be as clear as possible. This is not reparations. This is not a legislative effort to directly address racial inequality in the United States. But as I argued last week, the previous efforts at expanding the role, the function, the level of support that the federal government offers for its citizens, the efforts that we tend to label the New Deal and the Great Society as the major efforts of the 20th century, tended to actually reinforce and, in fact, exacerbate racial inequality in the United States. And we are living with the aftermath of that. This had a lot to do with the tremendous power of Southern Democrats to shape that legislation and to control the way in which, in particular, it would be administered. It has a lot to do with a hold of a kind of thinking that's called racial liberalism by some critics. The idea that if you just give equal rights to people who have suffered centuries of discrimination, the equal rights will be sufficient to accomplish everything that needs to be accomplished. And what we see today is the results of that policy in the greater chasm of inequality between black and whites in 2020 than existed in this society in 1930, right? And that's not because this legislation, for the most part, actively kept blacks down. It's not the white supremacist legislation of earlier eras, but it is because it lifted up white citizens, creating a middle class, and excluded African Americans from these benefits, that we see greater inequality, greater segregation in this country today than we had 90 years ago. I'm going to suggest today the overall rubric of zero sum racial thinking. You might just call this flat out competitive racial thinking, right? The idea is basically that what makes one group better necessarily makes the other group worse, because the groups are in a competitive situation. They are fighting over a limited pie. If whites get a bigger slice, blacks necessarily get a smaller slice, and vice versa. And I would suggest to you, in ways that I will argue today, that if you really think about the role of race in American history, you can understand why zero sum is the default for thinking about race relations in America. What benefits one group almost of necessity disadvantages another, but that we might just be on the cusp of policy breakthroughs that might allow us to escape from some of the gravitational pull of zero sum thinking and get to a place where we have policies in place that benefit African Americans and white Americans in ways that pave the way for a more cooperative future. And that, in a sense, we can't lose track of that as we look at the horse race and the horse trading and the log jams in Congress around this legislative agenda. So very quickly, and I'm just going to give an overview of some of the stuff that's playing out in American politics right now. And the first thing, of course, is the pandemic and the fact that 2,000 Americans are dying each day in the United States this week from the pandemic, right? This exceeds the death tolls of the worst days of the Vietnam or Korean Wars. This is more like the levels of fatality associated with the bad days of World War II. And so we are in the grips of a very destructive moment. It is entirely preventable, right? We have more than enough vaccine, and the vaccine is highly protective. We've had it and have made it available to everyone who is medically qualified for it for a very long time, right? And nevertheless, a substantial portion of our population is resistant. And so over the last couple of weeks, the Biden administration has tried to become more coercive about forcing members of the public to take the vaccine who are employed by relatively large corporations as an occupational health and safety measure. Whether that's going to be upheld will be determined in the courts quite soon, at least whether or not there will be an injunction against it. If it is upheld, then a substantial portion of the unvaccinated may have to choose pretty soon between keeping their jobs or taking the vaccine. There's more in the news about vaccine politics, not all of it that I'm happy with. Yeah, I think there is some growing evidence of politicization of public health within the Biden administration, and that's not a good thing. But having said that, I don't want to concentrate there this week. I'm also not going to concentrate on voting rights legislation, although I think this is critically important. And as you're aware, Joe Manchin was able to negotiate a voting rights bill that essentially does everything he wants done and nothing he doesn't want done. He's essentially a omnibus committee of one or maybe two with Kristen Sinema in the Senate right now. And the next question, I think, is going to be whether Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema will agree to suspend the filibuster in order to get at least this critical democracy protecting piece of legislation passed. This has a very strong racial component to it, but I'm not going to talk very much about it today. Third issue, which we will have to return to in a future lecture, concerns the fact that Texas has recently put into place, as of September 1st, legislation that empowers ordinary citizens anywhere in the country to sue any abortion provider for providing an abortion after, say, 6 to 8 weeks of pregnancy, i.e. a period in which many women don't even know that they're pregnant, effectively overturning Roe v. Wade. That is to say, removing the constitutional right to abortion that has been in place in this country for the last 50 years. Playing out in the courts very soon, the question of whether or not that legislation will be upheld by the Supreme Court, something that we should be paying attention to, but I won't talk about today because instead I want to focus on the big items of legislation making their way through Congress right now. Items that we've talked about before, and you will recognize this slide. There is the infrastructure deal, so-called bipartisan infrastructure deal, that you could dispute how much the price tag is. Maybe it's $1 trillion. I believe it's 550 billion of new appropriation. And the House has a self-imposed deadline of 2 days from now to consider or to vote on this legislation. That's put in place by House moderates, so-called, but House progressives have demanded that before they vote on this legislation, they want to see either passed or at least in sight a much more ambitious partisan piece of legislation from the Senate that contains many of the priorities that were cut from the original Biden legislative agenda in order to get bipartisan support. And the price tag on this legislation was $3.5 trillion. I think there's a snowflake's chance of hell that price tag will actually be on a final bill. It's far from guaranteed that any bill will pass, right? There is absolutely no margin of error for the Democrats. They have exactly 50 members in the Senate. So if every one of them votes for this, it will pass. But having said that, that puts the most conservative members of the Democratic caucus in the driver's seat. And again, that means Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, and there's every indication that there's no way that they will go for $3.5 trillion. Now, whether that will be a much more pared back, maybe $900 billion piece of legislation that does rather little of what Biden proposed, or something, in the range of 1.5 to 2.5 trillion that does a fair bit of what Biden proposed, but not all of it, or something that does much of what Biden proposed, but does it for shorter periods of time in order to keep the price tag down. I'm not sure, but those are the possibilities that are on the table, in addition to complete collapse and failure, which I think is a genuine possibility. And I certainly don't have a crystal ball to know which one is going to play out. What I'm going to discuss with you is the reason I'm rooting for some relatively large piece of legislation passing Congress so that the infrastructure bill goes through and is accompanied by much more ambitious transformative legislation. Now, in addition to that, right, Congress has a lot else on its agenda. The funding bill to keep government open, the debt ceiling to keep our government able to meet its obligations. And all of this is playing out, it appears, over the next few weeks. So the politics of all of this reflects the fact, as I've shown you before, I don't like looking at this as much as we are in the middle of a non-election year, but it does seem to me to be very relevant to the current debate, which is to say that Biden's approval rating has stabilized, but it is in negative territory, which means more people disapprove of him than approve of him. It's a very small negative margin, 2 or 3%. And his approval has come up a little since it really dipped as a result of the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan and the chaos that accompanied that. But nevertheless, it's not going back up to the low to mid 50s where it was at the first 8-9 months of his presidency. And so I do think one way to look at this is that if the Democrats fail to pass anything, they enter the elections of 2022 without any legislative accomplishments to show for their control of both the presidency and the Congress, with a president who's not particularly popular. Please note that the narrative of a failed presidency is starting to take hold in the conservative media. And the worst thing the Democrats could do from their own point of view would be to give greater credibility to that narrative by failing to do anything in uh, late September, early October of 2021. And so I do think the Democrats need to win, both for Biden's sake and for their own sake. I'm not sure whether this is a real standoff or just a negotiating posture. We will know better in a week or two. But I'm hopeful that the progressives, the moderates, Cinema, Manchin will ultimately recognize not only that politically it is so strongly in their self-interest to get something done, but that from a policy and historical point of view, this is a rare opportunity. And as I'm suggesting, an opportunity to perhaps even change the trajectory of American politics and history. And so that the weight of failure, but also the tremendous opportunity of success may guide them to some kind of compromise. This, of course, is also underpinned by economic considerations. The recovery does not appear to be stalling. We don't seem to be going back into recession territory, but it certainly has slowed dramatically. Remember that we are still down about 5 million jobs at least from where we were at the start of the pandemic recession. And so the pace of job creation is extremely important. At the current pace of job creation, it looks like it could take 4 or 5 years just to get back to where we were. And then when we talk about the policy dimension of all of this, I won't reiterate, right? American infrastructure gets a D plus grade. 60% of American children experience food vulnerability or hunger on a monthly basis. We don't provide adequate health care, and we charge way too much. We spend way too much for inadequate health care. There is much to be accomplished, much that we have neglected as a country. So having said all of that, let me just refresh your memory briefly. This is that complicated pie diagram that shows you everything that was in the original Biden infrastructure plan. This is called the Families Plan in the kind of whatever that color is, light green, and then the infrastructure plan in salmon. And it's sometimes called the More Care, Less Carbon Plan. Lots of money for education, including universal pre-K, lots of money for child and family support, including 225 billion for childcare, lots of money in tax credits, especially the ongoing support for the child tax credit, which has dramatically reduced poverty in the United States, an expansion of Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, tax credit subsidy for healthcare, right? And then stuff to do with supporting electrical vehicle infrastructure, hardening our buildings against climate change, supporting in-home care for the disabled and elderly, right? This is a huge policy agenda. Just to refresh your memory, again, this is what was cut out to get the bipartisan deal. And so note first that everything in teal or whatever this color is gone. And then when we look at what happened to the stuff in salmon, that's a zero, that's a zero, that's a zero, that's a zero. Everything else contracted significantly, right? So the bipartisan deal is a tiny fraction of the overall agenda. And this is why it is that progressives say they are unwilling to pass it unless they are also presented with legislation that puts some of the meat back on the bones of the original Biden policy agenda, right? So with all of that as a refresher, I now want to point out to you that what we spoke about last week was the fact that on the one hand, the last time the United States undertook this kind of expansion of governmental services, regulation, and the role of government in everyday life, it was done by a Congress that was almost exclusively white. And that in particular, the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats, had a stranglehold on the Democratic caucus, that they had the highest seniority of any members of Congress. And so they controlled the key committees of both the Senate and the House. And the result was that they only passed legislation that would protect Jim Crow and racial privilege. And the result is that in the aftermath of what we like to think of as the progressive high watermarks of the 20th century, the New Deal, and the Great Society legislation, we are in fact more unequal as a society. And that's not accidental, that is engineered in that legislation. But Congress today is much more diverse. And the Dixiecrats are essentially extinct, right? This is part of the realignment that happened in the last 20 years of the 20th century. We can see, right, the growth in diversity of the members of Congress over the last 20 years. We can see that Congress still is not as diverse as the US population. It's about 3/4 white, whereas the US population right now is only about 60% white. And we can finally see that that diversity is almost exclusively concentrated in the Democratic Party. If you look at the Republican Party in the House, right, about 10% of their members are people of color. If you look at it in the Senate, it's less than 5%. Whereas if you look at the House for the Democrats, it's basically almost 50% people of color. In the Senate, it's about 20% representatives of color. And my suggestion to you is not just that the racial composition of Congress matters to this legislation, but also that the current Democratic caucus has learned the lessons of the past. And that if we look, for instance, someplace I'm going to focus a lot today, at the way in which $213 billion for affordable housing would be spent. And by the way, economists believe that the lack of affordable housing drags employment down by as much as 1%, right? You know, when we want an unemployment rate of maybe 3 or 4%, it's a percentage higher than that because of lack of affordable housing. In ways I'll talk about today, if you can find housing in one of the metropolitan areas in the United States that is an engine of job creation, your opportunity for economic mobility is there, is genuine, is real. If you can't get to one of those areas, and maybe there are 8 or 9 of them in the country right now, your likelihood of economic downward mobility, of decline, is much greater, right? And the same thing applies for your children, right? And so not everything, this is not a reparations, this is not a racial justice legislative package, but there is stuff like the child tax credit, like universal pre-K, like funding for childcare, that as opposed to exacerbating racial inequality, would repair racial inequality in our society, would move us in the direction of greater equality. And that has a lot to do, on the one hand, with who the Democrats are, and on the other hand, sorry to say this, who they aren't. And so I'm going to focus on the Republican Party for a moment and point out to you that there's a very strong likelihood that the Republicans will control one chamber or maybe both chambers of Congress after the elections of 2022. And that likelihood will be greatly increased if the Democrats fail to pass any of this legislation. And although the Republicans might support some infrastructure legislation, they are very unlikely to support anything that would alleviate poverty in the United States in a way that equally assists people of color and white Americans. And I know that that's a strong statement. I want to try to provide some evidence for this. The first piece of evidence, I know you're probably close your eyes and see this diagram. I think it's so important, right? The Democrats basically mirror the national demographics in their support. They're about 50, 60% white still, but they're about 40, 45% people of color voting for Democrats. And so very much like their composition in Congress, frankly, right? They mirror the people who vote for them, and so do the Republicans, right? Because 90% of the people who vote for Republicans are white, and roughly 90% of the people who are representative Republicans are also white. But it's more than that. At least a substantial portion of the Republican electorate, and a portion without which Republicans really don't win elections, have high levels of ethnic antagonism or hostility directed specifically at African Americans, Latinx, Muslims, and LGBT people, right? And this is from research recently done by Lillian Mason, John Kane, and Julie Ronsky. And this is, if you will, the Trump wing of the Republican Party. It's not the whole Republican Party, and I think it's important to see that, but it's a substantial enough portion of the Republican Party that they're not going to win elections without them. And these people are the zero-sum people. Why are they hostile to Blacks, Latinos, Muslims, and gays? They see their interests as directly opposed to the interest of these people, that gains by Blacks, Latinos, Muslims, and gays mean losses for straight white Americans. And I'm going to provide some evidence for this now. This is new research that was done out of the University of Chicago, very recently published. And what this research shows to begin with, to select the subset of the Republican voters who are the core Trump supporters, they asked, how many of you agree, either strongly or somewhat, that the election of 2020 was stolen and that Donald Trump should be the president, right? And what you see is that it's about 25, 26% of Americans who agree with those statements. And then you ask, would force or violence be justified to take back the presidency for Donald Trump? We get 8% of the population agreeing with that statement. That's 8% of those surveyed, randomly selected Americans, and presumably that's somewhat representative, right? And then you focus on this group of people, right? The 26% who say they believe the election was stolen, and you ask them a couple additional questions. Do you agree with the following statement? African American people or Hispanic people in our country will eventually have more rights than whites, and 63% agree with that statement. So that's 63% of 26%. That's bordering on 15% of the population believing in what's sometimes called the Great Replacement or white replacement or racial replacement theory. And you may remember in Charlottesville, we had people marching, shouting, "You will not replace us," and then turning that into "Jews will not replace us," the Nazi slogan, right? This is that pattern of belief. And this is zero-sum thinking distilled to its core. If African American and Hispanics get rights, it will come at the expense of white people. By the way, 50% of that 26% subscribes to this basic QAnon idea that a secret group of Satan worshiping pedophiles is ruling the US government, right? And that, I guess, speaks to part of the reason that they're willing to use force or violence to overturn the election of 2020. And so this is my evidence for suggesting that a group, a political party that has a substantial portion of its electorate who believes in the great replacement or racial replacement or white replacement theory will not support any element of the current legislative agenda. And so if it doesn't pass now, I don't think it's very likely to pass, let us say, for at least another 4 or 5 years, right? And so with that analysis in mind, I think right the data on the disparities in opinion about who faces discrimination comes into a slightly different light. The majority of Americans think that African Americans face discrimination, but that's 3/4 of Democrats and less than half of Republicans. It's a 30% gap. We get down to the groups that a substantial portion of Republicans believe do face discrimination, right? Men, Christians, and whites. And so, right, big gaps here and real disparities in opinion, and this sense of racial grievance, this idea that the country is headed in a direction that disempowers the traditional majority group, and that the cost of that disempowerment is already felt in terms of downward mobility, growing precariousness, and this is just going to get worse. That will keep this legislative agenda from rising again for quite a while if it doesn't get passed now. Now, having said all of that, I now want to make two more arguments. One of them is a historical argument, and that is to understand a little bit about where zero-sum thinking comes from and how strong a hold it has on us. And I will apologize in advance. I'm moving fast today and I've got a lot to say. I'm going to be scandalously brief in my treatment of this material, but I just want to take enough away from it to better understand why zero sum seems to have such a powerful hold on many of us today. And so I'm going to look for a moment at three works. Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. Some of you may be familiar with her work from The Warmth of Other Suns, which won a Pulitzer Prize. Ibram X. Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And Kendi is also currently quite famous for his work, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And finally, a more kind of strictly academic work, and that's Howard Wynet's work, especially The World as a Ghetto, Race and Democracy Since World War II, but also his earlier work by Michael Omi called Racial Formation in the United States. And if I can bring into the mix as well, some of the journalists who are, I think, building on and making accessible the work of the kind of scholars I'm talking about, in particular, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's the kind of anchor of the 1619 Project at the New York Times, in the news quite recently for the controversy around tenure at the University of North Carolina. She is actually going to be joined on the faculty at Howard University by Ta-Nehisi Coates, the editor at The Atlantic, who more than half a decade ago published The Case for Reparations, something that in many ways got the whole ball rolling in terms of paying greater popular attention to the way in which contemporary racial inequality was engineered by government policy, right? And if I synthesize now some big propositions from this work, I want to start with the idea that race needs to be central to the way in which we tell the story of American history. That um, in our textbooks and in our national consciousness, in our culture, in our popular narrative of ourselves, slavery is perhaps understood as an unfortunate episode that we have created a clean line and break from. It's in the past now, right? And literally, you look at the structure of textbooks, and they look this way: a single chapter, and then perhaps some little boxes in the side, the margins of the textbooks on other aspects of African American history, but it's not seen as a central aspect of American history. And the works I'm talking about argue that you cannot account for the wealth of the United States without paying attention to the central contribution. And economists like William Darity try to put a price tag on it. It comes out in hundreds of trillions of dollars. The contribution of African American slave labor, indentured servitude, peonage during the Jim Crow period, that our initially agricultural economy, the basis on which the entire wealth of the United States was built, required the draining of swamps, the cutting and clearing of forests, and then the back-breaking work of harvesting tobacco and cotton and indigo, and that this could not have been done without the systematic exploitation of 6 million plus slaves over American history. And that it's not just slavery, it's also Jim Crow that is central to our economic history, and race is also central to our cultural history, to the way in which American identity was constructed, to in particular the conceptions of citizenship, freedom, and equality, to the process of assimilating successive waves of European immigration into the category white. All of this was defined against being Black, being enslaved, being the kind of person who was not qualified for citizenship, freedom, or equality. And that, again, the way Wilkerson puts this in her book on caste, slavery was not a chapter in its history, the history of this country, but the basis of its economic and social order, right? And so these historians are engaged in the project of making race central to American history, that this is necessary to counteract the ideology of minimizing race and suggesting that there have been clean breaks in American history in which we've put our reprehensible past behind us, that as opposed to this, we continue to be shadowed by that past. And that in a sense, right now, we're in the middle of a struggle over the control of the narrative through which we tell ourselves the story of our history. The whole debate around critical race theory in American schools and colleges is really about whether or not parents will be able to continue to tell their children, that's not us now, and not be counteracted or contradicted by what the children learn in school. And this narrative control, these historians suggest, has been a central element in maintaining racial order throughout American history. I'm going to speak a little bit about housing in a moment, and the ideas that have animated housing policy are very much produced by our racial history. And so the radical implication of this, and I'm those of you who are aware of Heather McKee's work, some of us may recognize the debt I have to her. She has a chapter called Never a Democracy, right? The radical implication of this work is that the United States may have long aspired to, but has never, in fact, been a democracy. If a democracy requires a principle of democratic justice that determines who gets full and equal citizenship, and that all persons afforded full and equal citizenship actually have the capacity to have equal influence over our politics. We have always fallen far short of the ideal we aspire to. And the final thing to see is that the claim of this body of historians is not that we have always had a single racial order or hierarchy. In fact, they argue that part of what makes the racial order in the United States so long lived is its mutability, that in its flexibility, its adaptability, also lies its resilience. And so that the legal institutions and the social implications of race have gone through several phases, but through each of those phases, racial hierarchy and subordination have been maintained. And the radical claim is that in certain respects, the current racial order secures racial inequality in a way that may be more lasting and more difficult to counteract than the more explicitly supremacist earlier epics. So let me give it an illustration, and this is one that has, I think, very important contemporary relevance. If there are these three periods, the period of slavery, the period of Jim Crow, and then the post-civil rights era that we're still in today, there's a contemporary young Princeton historian. You may know her from the writing that she does in the New York Times, or the fact that she's in the media a fair bit. Her name is Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, and she's written several books, but I think the one that really is the basis for her rise in the academy is this book called Race for Profit: How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Home Ownership. And it really focuses on the period after the Fair Housing Act of 1968, after the Kerner Commission essentially suggested if you want to put an end to a decade's worth of regular rioting in Black inner cities, you've got to do something about the quality of the housing. And so the Johnson administration created the Housing and Urban Development legislation and the Fair Housing Act to try to respond to the Kerner Commission report. And the big division that Taylor introduces is between what she calls predatory exclusion in the racially bifurcated housing market. And the idea here is, right, that, as you're familiar with, as we discussed last week, redlining, right, at the period in which the US government provided mortgage support to make housing available to middle class people. People within the government, people within the banking industry started drawing lines on maps to determine which areas would get support from the federal government and which areas were too risky and would be excluded. And we now know, because historians have done the archival work, that essentially the people drawing the lines used race as a surrogate for risk. And so just drew red lines around Black areas, that if your neighborhood was more than 25% Black, you were going to get coded in yellow, and that was a, be very careful area. If it was more than 50% Black, you're going to get coded in red. That was a no-go area for the mortgage industry. The federal government wouldn't support you, wouldn't insure you, wouldn't bank you. And so African Americans were excluded from the from the housing market. And this resulted in a racially bifurcated housing market. And please note that there's something called the racial premium for living in white neighborhoods. If you live in an area that is dominantly white, housing values tend to be about 40% more than if you live in a racially mixed area. I think there are exceptions to this, but this is the general rule. And real estate agents who make their money off commissions had every incentive to maintain those mainly white areas, to assist them in maintaining their value and hence maintaining their income. And when new legislation was passed, Taylor suggests we move from the period of predatory exclusion to the period of predatory inclusion. And what she means by this is that although the federal government said we will not redline anymore, and not only that, we will target mortgages for the inner cities, for African Americans, for people who are poor and have been excluded in the past, they did nothing to assist African Americans in moving into suburban areas, into white areas, into higher value areas. And as a matter of fact, they changed the entire nature of the mortgage and the real estate industries in order to profit from selling to people who essentially could not afford to purchase what was being sold to them. And so the term subprime, which I imagine you all know from subprime mortgage and the incredible damage that subprime mortgages did to the US economy leading up to the 2007 2008 economic collapse. What I learned from reading Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's book is that subprime was actually originally a real estate term for describing the neighborhoods where African Americans lived, and that subprime mortgages were devised for those neighborhoods. And subprime mortgages, the mortgage industry decided that it could make profits with high issuing fees on the assumption that the people who purchased the mortgage would ultimately default. But because under the Fair Housing Act, it was insured, they would nevertheless be reimbursed for their losses, and then they would keep the profits from the issuing fees, right? This is the way Taylor puts it at one point. I'm just going to read briefly from her book. Oh, I'm sorry. Where did I put that passage? There it is. I'm sorry. This is, I'm sorry, page 11 of the book. These contradictory objectives of real estate and home, one a commodity and the other intimating a place of belonging, also reinforced reactionary racial norms and deepened the perception of dual housing markets working at dual purposes. These racialized narratives of families, communities, and their built environments reinforced and naturalized the segregative practices among real estate brokers, mortgage bankers, and the white public. And I want to elaborate on this point a little bit. The basic claim here is that the idea of a home, right, the idea of a place where you build a life, in the public imagination of the United States of the middle 20th century was a white suburban space, right? And this is the kind of Leave It to Beaver thinking about what being home meant. And that on the other hand, in the racial imaginary of the United States, African Americans did not live in those areas. They lived in the cities. They lived in rental housing. They lived in tenements, in slums, in public housing complexes. And so if you were bringing them into white areas, you were bringing all of the pathology of urban America into an area that was supposed to operate according to a totally different logic. And that the reason that if you started to integrate a neighborhood, housing values plummeted had to do with that bifurcated understanding of race and its association with the housing, the home, the real estate, the property of different groups within our own society. And so zero-sum thinking here. If we let Blacks into our neighborhood, our prices will go down, is absolutely integral to understanding how racial inequality persisted and in fact was exacerbated despite the Fair Housing Act, despite the deliberate effort to undo the history of redlining, that the idea that the federal government relied on the banking, the mortgage, the real estate industry to administer fair housing meant that essentially they closed their eyes, they put on blinders to the way in which those industries made profit and to the very strong incentives those industries had to maintain segregation and hence to shuttle African Americans into substandard housing that was not going to be an avenue for inclusion, mobility, wealth building for them. And so with all of that in mind, now let me turn to the final book that I'm drawing on, that my thinking about the opportunities we face today draws on. And this is Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us. And I hope some of you may have heard of this, may even be reading it. It is very accessible. And I want to be clear, Taylor's book, Race for Profit, is an academic monograph. It's not that readable, but McGhee's book is wonderfully narrative, approachable, accessible. Heather McGhee, undergraduate degree from Yale, law degree from UC Berkeley, head of the think tank and policy research group called Demos here in New York. And she stepped down from Demos in order to do the research for this book. The cover of her book, as you may be able to see, shows a white boy jumping off a diving board into a swimming pool that a Black girl is climbing out of, right? And this reflects one of the stories that McGhee tells in her book, and it's the story of public swimming pools in the middle of the 20th century. And as some of you may be aware, before there were televisions, before there was much air conditioning, municipal swimming pools were the highlight of many children's summer experiences, right? And the United States had the largest, the best maintained, the most attractive swimming pools, municipal pools in the world. People came from Europe and other places to study our pools. And in the late 1940s, a US Supreme Court decision held that municipal public provisions could not be segregated. It's actually a precursor decision to the Brown v. Board decision. And the basic idea is if you're taking citizens' taxes to build these services, you have to make them equally available to all people. And here I need to go back a little ways and think about where segregation, where separate but equal, but where in particular the idea that public services will not be equally available to both races, and that if you're going to make them, you have to make separate facilities for the races. And please note, this is not only a Southern phenomenon. And I need to finish the story. I'm sorry that when the Supreme Court ordered that these facilities be integrated, first they were patrolled by vigilante whites with bats and knives and clubs, and any Blacks who tried to enter were beaten. Eventually, the court demanded that this be enforced, and then most municipalities filled their pools with dirt or concrete, closed them down rather than letting them be integrated. And this is, right, the idea that racism costs everyone, right? And the idea that rather than integrating the pools, we would close them is, for McGhee, a clear indication of zero-sum thinking and how much it costs us. But then the question is, why? Why would you do this? Isn't this crazy? And then I think you have to look back at the racial ideology of purity and contamination, and the idea that actually was propounded by American eugenics science by people at Harvard and Yale and Berkeley who maintained that not only were the races, hierarchically aligned with Europeans or so-called Aryans or Caucasians being inherently genetically superior to other races, but that there was a risk of contamination. That if the water was shared by white and black people, that it would in some way result in the contamination of the inferiority of black people into white people. And then again, Isabel Wilkerson tells the story very powerfully of how these ideas very strongly influence the development of German anti-Semitism. We tend to think of these ideas, I think, more in terms of the Holocaust, but they were very much present in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. And McGee says again and again, I can't go into all the details, but that if you look into the history of the provision of goods in the United States throughout the 20th century, what our government will provide, that the government will not provide services for white Americans if it is required to provide them equally also for Black Americans, and if the result might be that it would improve the standing of Black Americans, diminish the gap between white and Black Americans, suggest in some way that the races are equal. And so her claim is not only that we have all suffered and that white Americans have suffered in many respects from zero-sum racial thinking, right? But also that if we can escape it, we would all be better off, right? And she cites to some rather technical economic literature that suggests if whites and blacks had worked together in the union movement, we would have very different kind of healthcare and a very different kind of wage structure in the United States. We would look a lot more like Scandinavian countries than we look today. So the summary here, right? Zero-sum thinking suggests that either we improve the lot of whites or we improve the lot of blacks. And if we do anything to improve the lot of African Americans or racial minorities, we are going to necessarily subtract from the status, the standing, the well-being of whites. And that this idea is not something we can simply put behind us because it has deep historical roots. It still has a hold on the narrative we tell ourselves, the implicit psychology of many Americans, that it works not only at the level of society, policy, and social relations, in the housing market, in the way in which Social Security or the GI Bill is administered, in the degree of segregation, it also works on the level of individual psychology, that many white Americans subscribe to that great replacement or racial replacement theory because they feel their situation losing its standing. They feel that they're sinking socially, and they think that must be because others are rising and taking our place. That in the 21st century, the inversion here is the idea, well, as opposed to whites being clearly privileged, now that we've got a Black president, a mixed race woman as vice president, a significant portion of the members of Congress being people of color, it must be the case that they are now going to pursue policies that will advantage them by disadvantaging us, right? And so we've got to absolutely resist that legislation and try to regain our power, make America great again. And so the fact that this kind of thinking has a real grip on a substantial portion of the Republican leadership and especially the Republican electorate means that it's going to be very difficult to get the kind of legislation Congress is considering passed if it isn't passed in the next few weeks. And if, as I anticipate would be the case, the result is that Republicans regain a leadership position in at least one of the houses of Congress. But now, just for a moment, consider the alternative. Consider the possibility that we do pass legislation that benefits all of us in terms of housing, in terms of healthcare, in terms of childcare, in terms of education, and that we begin to see the advantages of this policy for our experience, for our ability to pay our rent, purchase homes, put food on the table, afford our medical care bills. I'm going to give the example of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. And you will know that when it was passed, its disapproval rating was higher than 60%. 60% of Americans opposed Obamacare when it was passed in the early years of the Obama presidency. You probably also know that today its approval rating is over 60%. And the reason that it was, I think, so strongly disapproved is that it was associated with Obama, with a Black president. It came to be seen as a racial issue. But over time, over the decade that that legislation has now been in force, we have come to see actually it hasn't harmed us, it has helped us. And so this is the idea of a policy feedback loop, potentially generating support for legislation which we currently oppose, even though it would be good for us. And so this is characteristic of a lot of partisan thinking in contemporary America. We are actually, as a people, quite liberal on policy issues. But when we think that our partisan identity means we should oppose that policy, we prioritize partisanship over policy. It seems to me the current legislation could possibly break that way of thinking, generate these policy feedback loops, and put us in a less competitive, more cooperative American future. And that as we watch the horse race and the congressional drama of the next week, we should bear in mind the deep historical significance of this legislation as well. All right, I've just threw a lot at you, and I want to hear your questions, your thoughts. Are you at all convinced that we might be able to get to a better place if some of this legislation passed? Do you think this legislation has a chance to pass? Who wants to start us off? Go ahead, John. You're going to have to unmute yourself. There you go.
I think it has a chance because the Democrats, even the so-called moderates, Joe Manchin and so forth, do still support President Biden, and they understand the stakes to Biden's reputation and therefore the prospects for the next election. That they'll do something to get together and pass it. It's going to be smaller. They'll take still more out of it. But and I agree with you that I'm not sure. I think you're right. The trend is sort of in the right direction on this, but I don't think there's going to be any, new morning sun coming up. I think it's quite incremental and comes over a long period of time.
Yeah, let me speak to that last idea, John. And as you can probably hear, I was trying to do an awful lot in this lecture, and I couldn't do it thoroughly. I need to unpack some of it. One of the ideas that's in the back of my mind while I'm saying this to you is an idea that comes out of Ibram Kendi's work, right? And so both Stamped from the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he tells the story that when he started writing Stamped from the Beginning, his hypothesis about American racism is that Americans were racist and therefore they passed racist legislation, right? That the causal arrow goes from racial attitudes to racial law. And he says as he did the history, he became more and more convinced that it's actually the opposite way around. That initially, in the 17th and 18th century, when our racist laws were passed, they were supported by a rather small minority of especially the planter elite, because they were worried that whites and blacks would work together. And if they did, if they organized, they would be powerful enough to challenge their economic dominance, right? And so they attempted to create legal differentiation. And this eventually took the form of suggesting that although whites, people of European descent, might be indentured servants, they could work their way to their freedom, and their status as indentured would not be transferred to their children. Whereas African Americans could not obtain freedom, nor could their children. They were, because of their race, permanently enslaved, right? And that eventually ideas grew up to justify, to rationalize, to make sense of the legal differentiation and the way in which it played out socially, right? And Kindy then suggests the converse hypothesis, which is that when law treats people equally, eventually racial ideas begin to subside. And he points to the Loving v. Virginia Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court decision that struck down anti-miscegenation legislation that made it legal in all states for people to have cross-racial or interracial marriages. And that at the time that decision was passed, about 2/3 of Americans opposed interracial marriage. And today, it's down to only about a quarter who at least are willing to say that when they're surveyed, right? And so his suggestion is, look, change the law, and the opinion, the hearts and minds of people will change as a result. And so I'm not saying we're at some watershed or inflection moment where, the people who believe in white replacement theory are going to have an epiphany and say, oh my goodness, how could I have thought that? But if this legislation counteracts segregation, counteracts the deep inequality in our society that sustains the myth of Black urban pathology, right? That the effect might be a decade from now that there's much less social basis for the kind of racial thinking that gives rise to great replacement paranoia, right? John, you want to come right back at me, don't you? Go ahead.
No, I'm agreeing with you, but I think I just wanted to make another point, which I think you made in lectures long ago, about generational change. I mean, if you look at the attitudes among the population today, it breaks down by race and by partisan, all the stuff that you've talked about a lot. But the thing is that among younger people who are educated or becoming educated, the attitudes are really very different. I mean, both on race and also on gender issues, which in some ways are sort of parallel. But those people, they're the ones that are going to college. Those are the ones who get in by their job. Presumably, they're going to be more or less running things, 10 or 15 years from now. And it'll be even more a quick question of this fervent minority against a growing consensus that's pretty positive. And that in some ways could really inflame it. I mean, you could say that what happened in the recent years has been the minorities getting so much smaller and so defensive and so angry that they're, infecting, that they can really generate a lot of emotion and even violence. But the hope would be that that's the sort of dying throes of this movement, and shows that it's no longer anything like a majority movement. It's very much an embattled minority.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's something that Nicole Hannah-Jones said in an interview recently, where she said, look, if you thought white supremacy was going to go quietly into the night, you're from a different planet than I'm at, right? You should expect that if it is in fact endangered, that that will be the most dangerous period. And one of the things to note, this is a point Howard Wynett makes, I think, very well, but others make it as well, which is that actually racial suppression and violence got worse with the abolition of slavery. And I'm not quite sure how to quantify that or how to make that comparison, but that in a sense, the fragility of white supremacy led to greater viciousness in its enforcement. And the other point that many of these thinkers make, Isabel Wilkerson, Hannah McKee make it, I think, very powerfully, which is if at some level you know that the idea, and we can put it in different ways, right? But let's start with the deserving versus undeserving poor. That people like me don't want handouts from the government. We work for what we get, and we don't want, therefore, to support programs that only benefit those people who never work and just take and take and take all the dole that the government will give it. If at some level deep in the recesses of your consciousness, you just know that's a false narrative, that you're pumping yourself up by opposing yourself to people who actually, if you look around you, it's not that hard to see the evidence that they are in fact very hardworking people. That if you look around you, you also get a fair bit of evidence that people like you benefit from these programs and are not necessarily always the deserving poor. Then there's some insecurity, some instability, some nagging knowledge that the story that you tell yourself that's essential to your self-esteem is false. And that often that makes people quite vicious, that they have to violently assert their rectitude, the truth of the story they're telling themselves, in order to keep that nagging doubt down, right? And so yes, as a social structural matter, the demographic changes that are playing out in our society, the contracting basis of support for white supremacy, the generational change that you're pointing to, and then also at an individual psychological basis, the self-doubt that has to accompany the people who tell themselves this mythology. I think all of this maybe helps to explain some of the violence of the present moment. And maybe then we just have to get through it, and there is a better era awaiting us. Flossie, go ahead.
Yes, along those lines, when the right goes to such extremes in their struggle to outlaw abortion, and argues that even a rape isn't enough, it becomes so outrageous that you have to question all of the premises. Or that little group in the QAnon who argued that some of the Democrats belong to a satanic society and also are a group of pedophiles. Some of them don't even know what pedophiles mean, I dare say, or if they do, they don't care. It becomes outrageous and they begin to sound ridiculous, even to those people who had never thought about extremities. So they're cutting their own throats, I think, I hope.
So Flossie, I hope you're right too. I'm just going to point, and I'm sorry to be the contrarian here a little bit, but to the psychology experiment, where you put a bunch of people in a room, you have two pieces of wood, one of which is obviously shorter than the other, and you have everyone in the room in on it except for the subject, and everyone in the room says that the shorter piece of wood is the longer piece of wood, right? And then what we find is between 40 and 60% of people say, okay, yes, the shorter piece of the wood is the longer piece of wood, right? And this is in part about the way in which people succumb to peer pressure, but it's also about groupthink. It's about the way in which we doubt our own cognition when the reality that is mirrored back to us by everyone around us is discordant with what we believe. And so the connection here has to do with the media environment. It has to do with the fact that so many of the people who believe the QAnon crap, or who continue to believe the white replacement theory or the mythology of the deserving and undeserving poor, are reinforced in their beliefs, not only by everybody around them, but by seemingly authoritative people on Fox News and on social media outlets of various kinds. We got to be careful in thinking that this is just a house of cards getting ready to collapse at any moment, because it's a house of cards where the architecture is being shored up by some pretty powerful and influential forces. If you remember last week, I showed you a little bit of data about the way in which Fox News began to change the narrative of the Black Lives Matter protests, and to emphasize rioting and looting as opposed to protesting, and the way in which that seemed to change white public opinion in this country, right? And so I guess I'm a little concerned about the degree to which public opinion can be influenced, you might even say engineered, especially in the current media environment, which is both very segregated and in which a portion of the entire media enterprise is making its money by reinforcing the identities of people who want desperately to believe that they are in the better part of the population, but their race, their group is under attack and needs to defend itself.
So maybe we need to get a group of sociologists or psychologists who argue that people who are so afraid of pedophiles are afraid of that tendency in themselves, and keep that up for a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
I don't know, but I thought I would shed some light on this situation.
And so the alternative, it seems to me, and you started with Texas, right? Is that a whole bunch of industries will potentially leave Texas if this legislation is upheld, and that a bunch of educated women who want their rights upheld will reverse the recent patterns of demographic shift, and that ultimately it will become economically untenable. Not to mention the fact that maybe some of the daughters of the people currently supporting this legislation.
Yes, we mustn't. I agree with you, and I agree that you don't fight dirt with dirt unless you're down to the level of just plain dirt. I'm rather hopeful. I think not that we must prevail. We can't face the other. That's
well, and I guess a week or two from now we'll be back together and we'll have a much better sense of what's actually happened with this legislation. Not that this legislation is the only place that this struggle is being played out, but it seems to me of critical importance. Wonderful being with you all.
Yeah.
Have good weeks, be safe, and I'll see you next week, okay?
David,
Yes.
we have a question on the 8th floor.
Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
Okay. Sorry. Go ahead, hon.
Hi, my name is Lloyd Morgan. What you never touched on, and which I'm not being a challenge to that, but why are we not looking at the trillionaires and the billionaires and taxing them at an incredibly high level from their point of view?
Yeah, so Lloyd, thank you for the question. And I actually have lectured on this before, although it's been more than, gosh, a year and a half ago. But yes, look, I've touched mainly on the provisions of this legislation that have to do with the goods and services it's going to provide, as opposed to the provisions that have to do with how it's going to be funded. And I do think there are some provisions that are quite progressive in terms of increasing the tax rate for wealthiest Americans. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there's an op-ed in the New York Times today about the so-called step function in taxation, which allows billionaires to transmit a large amount of wealth to their children, and their children to pay rather de minimis taxes on it when they liquidate their assets, right? Yeah, there's tremendous unfairness and inequality in our tax code, and note that that tax code is mainly written by lobbyists, and that the people in the industries who can afford lobbyists are the hyper wealthy, right? Or the really concentrated wealth, and that this is undermining our democracy. So I completely agree with you on this. It just really wasn't my topic for today. But yes, it's something I will return to at some future point. And thank you for pointing out the messiness, the interconnectedness of all of this. This would not appear to be so difficult to fund were it not for the Trump tax cuts of 2017, and then successive rounds of tax cuts prior to that, and the great inequality in the carrying of the tax burden in the United States today. I completely agree with that, Boyd. Thank you for the question.
And I look forward to having an additional comments next week.
Very good. Okay. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, David.
Next week. Thank you all. Bye-bye, guys.